Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm so pleased that you're joining us this morning. We're at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Peter Walsh, and here with Lise, Leist, and Tom Jones. This is Talk About Race in America Today. Let us begin with prayer, and I'm going to begin with a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer. It's the prayer for the whole human family. Let us pray. O God, you made us in your image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love. And work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So the topic of the day is the topic of the day. And by that I mean we're just going to have a conversation about all that's unfolding around race in America today. We really want you to participate in the conversation, and you can do that by clicking on your screen and typing a question, and Jill, the director of all things St. Mark's, will pick it up. It would be great if you would let your questions be known to us on the sooner than later side, just because there is some processing time. So what a great day it is for us to have you two here. For the people who know you, everybody I know who knows you incredibly honors each of you and greatly honors your voice. So inquiring minds, in some sense, want to know what you think about what's happening in our world today. So Lise, you were the first in your family to go to college, and you rose up to become the chair of the board of your college. And Tom, as I've said before, and my kids most love that introduction, 55 years ago, you walked out of Willard Straight Hall with a gun, and then you rose up not only to be on the Cornell board, but an emeritus member of the board and even the medical school, too. You have spent your life, much of your life, in education, and you're particularly trained in inclusion and diversity and bias questions. Tom, you've spent much of your life in the business world. You guys have been friends for 30 years, members here for 30 years, and yet each of you, I think, would say that you're wired differently in many ways, too. You have a great communion with one another, and you have so much to say to us. So we have 2 Sundays left because, as I hope you all know out there, we're moving toward the 9 o'clock Holy Eucharist outside, continuing with the 10 o'clock stream. But for the next 2 Sundays, let's have a conversation. And so let's talk about, I mean, it's unbelievable what has happened in the amount of time here. I wrote down yesterday that George Floyd was murdered 27 days ago. On May 25th, and in 27 days, the world has been lit on fire in protest, and the highlighted struggle that all black people, and certainly people of brown colors and black colors, have been fighting in the United States for years and years and years has just come to the light. And one of the things that has come to the light to white America has been Juneteenth. And a holiday unknown to probably most of white America, and now celebrated. Governor Lamont said, had a special proclamation on Friday for Juneteenth. So I wonder, Lise, starting with you, what do you make of a white America waking up to Juneteenth?
Well, I think it's important for us to examine our past. So our past, our present, to get to the future. And this is a very tragic past. And you know, as an adult now, but I can say that coming up as a child in schools, Juneteenth was not discussed at all. It would be discussed in our churches, but not discussed in our history. And coming from an educator's perspective, our books that we have now really don't lend themselves to give this kind of history. So how we are all coming out now as a result of George Floyd's death or not, it's like all of our history is coming up. And so we're reliving it in the good way. I think about, as a teacher in 5th grade, we had to teach all of our students about the explorers. And no one wanted to hear about, you know, we had Cortez and you had Balboa and you had other explorers, but the one explorer that was out there was Columbus, and not knowing the real history of Columbus. And so it's the same thing with Juneteenth. We just don't understand that history. And so bringing it to light now, but will it become a holiday? There was a proclamation in Stanford where they did acknowledge it. but let's acknowledge it for the right reasons and have the right understanding of what this came about and why it came about.
Yeah, thank you. Tom, just an initial thought about that?
Well, I'd make 2 points. One is that I'm impressed that a number of major corporations, Nike, MasterCard, Target, declared Juneteenth as a holiday. And that's significant because it was a moral decision they were making. There wasn't any law passed that said, you know, Juneteenth will forever be a holiday, and so everybody has to give their employees a day off. These companies said, we're going to declare this a holiday as a moral statement of what we believe in. And that is a statement of the heart, and that's very important because one of the reasons when we pass law, it doesn't necessarily get reflected into action is because the heart doesn't necessarily follow the law. So this statement from the heart from major corporations is important. Secondly, the spotlight on Juneteenth, which happened because President Trump was originally scheduling a rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma for Juneteenth, also brought a media spotlight on the Tulsa race massacre of 1921, which is arguably one of the worst episodes of racial bloodshedding in the history of this country. And the significance of that media spotlight, my guess is that millions and millions and millions of Americans are saying, oh my goodness, did things like that really happen in this country?
100%.
And you know what, Father Peter? As I read the stories, the media carefully, there are so many people from Tulsa itself, whose families are from Tulsa, who say, we didn't know anything about this. And it's because this country is silent. You know, we have a long history of being silent about these aspects of our history. And so I think that's really important that millions of Americans are now saying, my goodness, are these the kinds of things that transpired in the history of this country?
Yeah, thank you about that. Thank you for that. And yes, 300 people killed. It just is shocking.
But Tulsa was the Black Wall Street. That was significant. Black folks really had significant importance in Tulsa, built their own banks, built their own businesses. They had it. They had systems in place. And to see that taken away, and again, to the survivors, the families that are finally having some opportunity to talk about it, because we've been silenced. It isn't a story that's been shared about the success of Black folks in Tulsa and the history behind it.
Well, so much of what's unfolding now in real time is the question of who controls the narrative. What's in the narrative, who's in control of the narrative? And certainly this is something that is been moving through academia for many, many years. When I was in seminary, it was the feminine critique was really rising up to say it's been a lot of white men telling the story, and it's about time for women to get involved in the story and to tell the story. And now, since then, people of color have joined in and said, well, what about our narrative in the story? And so as you were saying, history books don't have this in the history book, so if you don't learn it in 5th grade, it doesn't become solidified in your foundational thinking about who we are as a people and what we are as a country. And so all that is unfolding in rapid real time around statues of Confederate armies, Confederate generals, about colonialism encased in a statue in a town square. And Robert E. Lee in Richmond, the judge says, no, you can't take Robert E. Lee down in another portion of Richmond. A statue is ripped down and thrown in a lake after it is burned. Christopher Columbus statue. So I wonder if you might share a little bit more about this question of narrative in the story, and are we at a tipping point where the story of the whole people of our country gets to be told? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think storytelling is how you arrive to get to your understanding of social justice, and we have to share the stories. I brought this one book because I wanted to talk about just for a second because it's by Bruce Jacobs, and it's about race manners. He's a Harvard grad. He's done a lot on NPR, and that way. So, and the one piece that he speaks about, you know, with real estate brokers, it's always about location, location, location. He speaks about proximity, proximity, proximity. How do we get close to have those discussions and being civic, being respectful of one another to understand where we need to go? And I think that's how we have to empower our students, our children, to start these narratives early, start telling the stories early. Then you will help them get to a different decision. It shouldn't be as an adult now that you're finally hearing about the stories, the narratives. I have my narrative, I know Tom has his, and you have yours, and such, but we need to start sharing that in a global way to help us all understand how to arrive to that one spot. So it is about proximity. It's bringing ourselves in, not the location, but how can we bring ourselves in?
Yeah, beautiful.
Let me give 3 brief examples on the statue question. On the news last night was that a statue of Ulysses S. Grant was torn down and trashed. That's totally wrong. That's really ignorance of history. Ulysses S. Grant had one slave, which happened because he married into a slaveholding family who gave that slave to him as a gift. Ulysses Grant freed that slave voluntarily, would not take compensation for it, freed the slave after working with the man for a few, just said, this is the wrong thing. So, for us to have this, what I call, rage is often ignorant. And I think this is a perfect example of ignorant rage. And it is not going to take us anywhere that's positive. Second example would be, there are arguments about taking down the statues of Jefferson and Washington. I think that's wrong. And the reason I believe it's wrong is because they are men who are products of their time and should be judged by the full balance of their lives. And even though they were slave owners, they also were builders of this creed that's articulated: all men are created equal. The creed that underlies America, even though they didn't extend that creed very far beyond basically rich white men.
Right.
The creed was articulated as the founding principle of this country. That's why America is the shining light on the hill, because it was the only place in the world that articulated that creed. And over the years, that creed has been broadened, the application of that creed has been broadened to more and more people. So I believe that people like Washington and Jefferson should be honored because the balance of their contribution to society in the building of this country on that creed far outweighs them being products of their time and slave owners. Third example would be these Confederate generals, such as Lee or Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy. These are people who rose up in treason and rebellion against that very creed of America, that all men are created equal. They fought an armed rebellion to overturn that principle, that all men are created equal, because they did not want it applied to the slaves. And so to honor men who not only fought an armed rebellion, but were trying to overthrow the most fundamentally important principle on which this company is based, to honor them in the public square and to say, well, everything after all is okay, they were just talking about states' rights, I think is wrong. And they should not be honored. They can be honored by their ancestors and their relatives and so on in a private museum. They certainly have a right to that. But they should not be honored in the public square as somehow representative of what this country stands for.
And the ones that have been taken down are basically just housed. They've been removed, but they're housed. So that's another message. So I agree with you, Tom. Let's change that narrative to give the real history and move them to a place where, if they want to be looked at and viewed, when I took a trip to the South and looking at my first trip to the South by myself, going from Atlanta to Mississippi to Alabama, and seeing the Confederate flag with the American flag. That was hard. That was really hard. But I also had to put myself in a different frame of mind and saying, I know what it stands for, but I cannot let that lead me. I cannot let me lead me. Going south was a challenge, and I still think there's so much work that has to be done just in that area. Galveston too, Tulsa, but in the South, where we really haven't addressed the issues.
Well, so much in what each of you just said here. Just going to stick with the Confederate flag here just for a moment. I think for people who grew up in the North, the Confederate flag, we don't have any, it seems odd. Maybe that's a way of saying it. But I read yesterday that the SEC, the sort of godhead of college football, right, and college basketball down south, and the SEC governing body said to the state of Mississippi that they felt that the Confederate flag should be removed from their state flag, and that until it is done, that Ole Miss or University of Mississippi and Mississippi State would not be able to host SEC events or something like that, that the SEC had gotten involved in. I mean, any thoughts on that? I mean, we're finding all kinds of shifting and moving stuff in the athletic world and the Confederate flag and what that means to people.
Well, I think it's another example of the changing of the hearts in America. Yeah. Nobody forced, I guess it's the Southeastern
Conference.
SEC, right, is the athletic conference. Nobody forced them to do that. They're now saying it's the right thing to do. And, it's often said that the South lost the Civil War, but they won the peace. And meaning that all of this mythology and story was built up with regards to these noble soldiers just fighting for states' rights and local democracy and so on, and they kind of sugarcoated. It wasn't really about maintaining slavery. And all of America went along with that for many, many, many years. And that's how these symbols, the statues and the flag, continued to be kind of glorified, throughout the country, not just in the South, but it was represented throughout the country. That's why NASCAR is a national sport. That's a national event. The hearts, I think, are changing now. Many, many hearts across this country are changing, not because there's a law that says they have to. These are moral decisions that are being made to say, no, this is not right. What this flag represents is oppression.
Right.
And that's not right. We will not permit it. And so I'm very encouraged.
I am too. When you think about, 20 million Africans were brought to this country to work this country. And we cannot dismiss how it started simply by sugarcane, something that we all enjoy today. We all enjoy sugar. But had it not been for that time in the early 1500s with Columbus and this one crop, that they needed labor. They needed labor to do it because the Indians, that's what they referred to at that time, now we know it's Native Americans, those were the laborers. But they said, no, not for me. So the goal was to go take people to work the land. 20 million African folks came to this country. And then you have the Middle Passage, where it just became money, big money. So to hear about these corporations now doing this work, yes, they need to do this work. They need to stand with their mission and vision. It was wonderful to hear this week that Netflix has pledged $40 million to education through United Negro College Fund, Spelman College, and Morehouse. Yes, more need to do that. More need to find ways of how are we going to educate and bring our folks up, and everyone up. And so I keep going back to revisiting the past, because the past is not so clean. And I think about that many people coming to this country and working this country. So it's time. And so there's other stories that I'm sure Tom has his narrative and you have yours, but that's where it rests with me.
Well, let's stay for a moment on the economic narrative. So we have, obviously, in our country, agrarian, sort of the agrarian revolution of sorts, and then industrial revolution, and then on in. Now we're, of course, in the tech revolution. Tom, we've had some really good conversation about corporate America and the difficulties of black people rising up in corporate America. You spoke beautifully about corporate America and the movements and the pulling of money out of the system and the taking away of great livelihoods for the common man and the common woman. But the history of our historic economy, oftentimes built on the backs of black people and brown people. And that was never part of our economic narrative. We told the story of what an incredible country we are, what an economic machine, capitalism is the thing, right? And yet this was the part of the narrative. It just wasn't a part of it. And then when that part of the story comes out, it's kind of like, oh wow, just and 20 million. Never mind the systemic issues that came, as you said, after the peace was won. And you, Tom, have been particularly articulate about this. This all people are created equal cannot get to that place unless there can be some economic equality in the systems. And you're talking about education in the system. Tell me about other things that have moved your heart in particular that have sort of popped out in these last few weeks of things that you didn't think might happen and you see them happening and you're like, oh wow, interesting that was something that popped up. Was there anything that really caught you off guard?
Give that one some thought.
Let me make a quick comment on the economics,
Yeah.
and then I'll give you an example of something that just popped out this past week. On the economics, there are lots of contradictions in America. There are beautiful things that happen in our economy. There's this entrepreneurial capitalism, which is really the secret sauce that makes America the envy of the world economically, where people that have innovative ideas, clever insights, we have capital markets that are enormously efficient at making financing available to these people to see if their ideas work, and then building companies. And probably one of the most powerful examples of that, our world has been changed by the invention of the personal computer, which put incredible amounts of computing power on the desk of every worker, both in the office and at home. And then this iPhone invention, this cellular phone invention, which essentially puts a personal computer in your pocket with all kinds of sophisticated communications applications. So things like we're doing today, holding this parish together with live streaming on Sundays would not have been possible without those inventions.
Amen.
And people make billions of dollars for doing that, and I don't think anybody begrudges them that success for what they've created. In fact, the most successful black businessman in this country comes from that milieu. Somebody named Robert Smith, billionaire, a Cornellian, okay?
Of course.
And he's the founder of Vista Equity Partners, which is the most successful software enterprise investment firm in this country. Started it in the year 2000. He's already a billionaire. And that's America. It's America at its best. And they contrast that, in the last recession, the Great Recession, millions of Americans lost their homes because of temporary unemployment or somebody getting sick in the family. This was in the years 2008 to 2012 in the Great Recession. Big private equity firms like KKR and Blackstone, they went out and brought up hundreds of thousands of single-family houses that were in foreclosure, okay? Because people, unemployment, whatever, they couldn't pay their mortgages. They bought up those houses at fire sale prices. The mortgage lenders had to sell the prices because they needed cash to protect their capital ratios so that regulators didn't put them out of business. The firms bought these houses, ended up then renting them out many times to the same homeowners who are still there, now paying rent. Fast forward to 2020, and housing prices have rebounded, but these people get none of the benefit.
Right.
It's owned by big capital in New York. And, you know, this is a side of our economy, Peter, which is why a lot of folks who are lower income and middle income feel like capitalism doesn't work for me. You know, it doesn't work for little people. The point I want to make is that in that same Great Recession, the government provided funding to protect the big banks. Okay, that's why a number of big banks didn't fail in the Great Recession. That same government could have provided funding to pay off, you know, to buy out the mortgages of those small homeowners, and then refinance the mortgages at the prevailing market prices, the same prices at which the private equity firms bought the houses, and allowed those people to remain in their houses as homeowners. And it's choices like that that the government makes which differentiate. Those are moral choices, and choices like that will determine whether we have an economic system that, frankly, earns, you know, the trust, does the right thing morally for our people. An example of something good that's happened in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I want to. Can I hold you on one sec? Tell me.
Why don't you let Tom keep going, because
Okay.
my questions are a little bit in different topics.
Okay, Kat, just wanted to check in with the
I
flow
want
here.
to bring it to New
just wanted turn the
Canaan,
flow.
something that happened this last week. I am enormously encouraged that over 600 current and former students of New Canaan High School signed a petition to the New Canaan Board of Education saying this town needs to be more attentive to issues of diversity and inclusion in the way we staff our Department of Education and our classrooms, and in terms of what we teach in our classrooms. Because when we watch what's now going on around this country with regards to questions of race and fairness, we have not been well prepared.
Right.
We have not been educated on this. We have not been prepared for this.
Yeah.
That's very encouraging.
Yeah, thanks for Tom. I didn't see that, but wonderful.
Yeah, I'm thinking back of several things that made me very hopeful this week. But particular attention to hearing that the Darien Police Commissioner has been removed from his responsibilities. We speak about social media and how you can use it the right way or the wrong way. And apparently he was putting out tweets that were completely biased, and has been held accountable. That gave me hope that Darien can move in that direction. I grew up in Rye, and to hear about Rye High School students that are doing the same thing, that have issued a petition, actually had several marches last week, really is inspiring, because that's a school that I went to and wouldn't think that they would follow suit. And to Tom's point about making sure that they shouldn't have to learn about this as an adult. They need to start learning about it very early on. And for them, these students, to advocate on putting those things in place is important. I can tell you this too, that the independent schools, the private day schools, boarding schools, they are having some serious issues right now. Because now you're talking about decades of students of color that have attended these schools that have some PTSD as a result. As a result, they are just beginning to try to figure themselves out. Heads of schools of these independent schools have a lot of work to do. They shouldn't have to have jobs like diversity, equity, inclusion directors there. This should already be in place. So I'm cautiously optimistic, especially with the private schools, that they will do the right thing. If you're going to bring students of color into these environments, make sure that they are supported. Make sure that they really, really are supported, because often they don't see educators like themselves. I think I was the first at King, the first educator of color.
Wow, yeah. Well, thank you for that. And of course, independent schools and private schools are, I mean, it's hard to make a complete blanket statement about all of them, but for sure, I mean, this news is coming out. I was in the New York Times the other day about some of the private girls' schools in New York City. My daughter went to Northfield Mount Herman, a boarding school in north central Massachusetts, and a progressive school from its beginnings, and where these topics were built into their curriculum long ago, but they're definitely one of the few that really has built up the whole thing. I want to come to, as we said earlier, to the conversation includes everybody, not just the three of us. Jill, you want to say what's out there a little bit?
Sure. So this is, I think this is an excellent question. Is there, you're both very patient. I'm just going to read this actually because it's well written. You're both remarkably patient about the narrative, the situation, inequality, and racism in America. Where does that patience come from when there's so much anger and rage seems everywhere?
I'm just going to go back to the way I was raised, and raised by a very strong black woman, first born free in her family, and watching what she did to come from Prince George County, Virginia, to Rye, New York, and how she got here as a young girl, and how she had to make her own way, and she was a domestic, and how she took care of other people's children, other people's homes, 7 days a week. And watching her work gave me the strength. And I know, there are certain things that I would say certain things, and she said, you don't want to do that. You don't want to say that. So I understood my triggers early on. And if I kept the hate in my heart, again, to Tom's point about having empathy for others, that's the only thing that's going to keep us going and keep me going. I can't carry that in my heart. It takes more energy to hate. A lot.
My patience comes from I focus on truth. And to me, the truth is that in my 50 years of adulthood, millions and millions of African Americans have received college educations in this country. Many of them at the most elite institutions in this country, far more than ever happened in any prior generations of African Americans. The truth is that millions and millions of African Americans have been able to lift themselves out of poverty in the last 50 years. The truth is that in every occupation and profession in this country, African Americans have reached the top, have reached the very pinnacle of every single occupation and profession in this country. That is truth. It's as true as the Tulsa race massacre in 1921. America is a country of contradictions. America is not an evil country. There are evil people in America, and there are evil events which occur in America. America is also a loving country with people of great love and compassion, and there are wonderful things that happen in America. And the truth is that we each have to understand those diverging elements within the country and understand how we can contribute to making the loving, compassionate America more dominant going forward than it has been historically. And my personal opinion is that we're not going to get there through rage or through violence or through looting. We're going to get there by calling to a higher moral standard. This was the power of what Dr. King did, by articulating a higher moral standard of love and demonstrating that higher moral standard in the way he conducted his movement. It brought out the best in America, and I believe we can do that again. It's already beginning to happen in some of the examples we talked about this morning.
Yeah, we have to keep looking up. You have to keep looking up. I promise that when it comes to scripture, I don't like to make it up, so I told my daughter that I'd have to read it because this stays with me. It says, let your conversations be gracious and attractive so that you have the right response for everyone. Colossians 4:6. That stays with me. That's the piece. Let our conversations be authentic. And to not be afraid to ask the questions. I'd much rather you ask me. I'd much rather you ask me so that we could have that conversation and to center ourselves and do it with peace and empathy and to be mindful of others.
Beautiful, thank you.
So I think this is a natural follow-on. Somebody wrote in asking the question in conversations about the expansion of Black Lives Matter. There sometimes is raised the question of black-on-black crime, and what is the message to say, you know, it should matter to you too, right? How do we extend that love to our own groups, but particularly in the context of Black Lives Matter? How do you bring that message across?
To me, again, it's a matter of recognizing the truth, which is that crime rates are very high in the Black community, often as a function of the denial of economic opportunity to large portions of the Black community. But it's a very real phenomenon, and it's one of the reasons why these calls to defund the police are, I think, not actions that can lead to constructive, positive outcomes. You know, we all saw in the Black Lives Matters demonstration that there were opportunistic looters hanging around the fringes of the crowd. I'm not going to pretend to myself that everybody has goodwill and that all of these people have moral intentions. It's just not true. That's not the truth. And I believe in focusing on the truth. And so Black Lives Matters is right in 90% of what they articulate, and they are right in the anger that they feel. But it doesn't mean that they're right with regards to saying that police departments should be defunded and things of that sort.
I'd just like to revisit supporting the wherewithal and understanding for Black men, Black males. And I think that it's often a missed opportunity to really educate our Black men so that and empower them to learn that they can and be and achieve so much. And there's a real gap. It seems like the girls in general just seem to have it focused, but I do think there's a miss on working with our Black males of this country.
Which you do as they're growing up. Your work with Future 5 is extraordinary, and you've shared some of that on the video that we talked about, and just really to, hold
different
these
conversations.
Yeah,
They're just
right.
different conversations. As this class of 2020, whether it's in Stanford or in California, there has to be some serious conversations on how to conduct themselves moving forward. This is a different time.
Do you want to we're going to come to Jill. Do you have one more sentence on that? I mean, versus clearly one of the things that all of white America is waking up to, and it certainly has been being said for a long time, which is that Black families, brown families have to speak to their children, particularly their male children, in a different way than white people do. And some of this has been brought out in shocking comic relief by Dave Chappelle, for instance, in his humor. And so, clearly what to do if you're pulled over by a police officer. Right. These are conversations that have been going on for a long time. But now as we, moved into this new sort of zone, is there something different besides those conversations that have been being had in Black households for a very, very long time?
I was thinking about that this morning. Growing up in Rye, whenever we went to a school dance, we would all go together. And we knew we had to be out of there by a certain time. And we were usually followed, with a police car to our home. So, the sundown towns are certain places you had to be out of there by sundown. But I don't think that's where we are so much, but I do think we just have to be mindful of where we are and know our surroundings. My son turns 32, and there's not a day that I don't think about that. Being a young man of color, always saying, be mindful of where you are, mind your surroundings, because you just don't know. But that's the way we've been my entire life. So I don't know of any other way but to share the importance of watching your surroundings, but not being afraid of the police either.
We need to invest in high quality education for communities of color, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's in the country's economic interest to do so.
Yeah. So I just so true. That's something that is often brought up about immigrants, for instance, why we need to have immigration flowing into our country, and yet the conversation about that with people already in our country wasn't heard so much. I'd say that. Joe, our clock is ticking. I don't know if you'd like to have time to do that. So let me just say that in the letter that came out for the in New Canaan High School, I can't quite do it, NCHS, New Canaan High School, alums. That letter was put together by Natalie Donahue, who's a member here, the Donahue family. And as the nation continues its awakening, I'm just wondering, there's great encouragement that we've come to a tipping point. Do you have any sense, if you were going to look out on the horizon, what do you think is going to happen here? Maybe that's just way too bold a thing to
I don't know. It's
guess.
Interesting because I keep hearing this time it's different. This is different. This time is different. So I think we're waiting. We're hoping that the movement sustains. Certainly, that we're not going to just check the box and move on, but it's going to take a lot. And I'm inspired. I am really inspired because it's not just me doing the work, or I'm doing the work, or you doing the work. I'm inspired by the country and the world doing the work. When my husband and I traveled to Germany and went to Auschwitz, and you can feel it. You can feel it when you walk in there. Yeah. But they're doing the work. They're educating us so that something like this doesn't happen again. So I'm hoping that there's a global commitment of let's do it. Let's get it done. We're not going to have a repeat of this. Yes, more folks will die, unfortunately, but let's stay hold and grounded to our principles and do it with all the right reasons and not just to check the box.
Yeah.
I'd answer with a historical metaphor. Laws changed in 1865. In the 1860s, there was a whole slew of legislation with regards to equal rights for African Americans. Hearts didn't change. A relatively small slice of African Americans, what W.E.B. Du Bois called the talented tenth, a small slice of Black America was able to break through and find economic opportunity and prosper. Laws changed again in the 1960s, with the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act and so on and so forth, and affirmative action. Laws changed. More hearts changed than had happened in the 1860s, and I would say about 50% of Black America managed to break through and prosper. And that's what I was referring to earlier with the millions of people who have achieved higher education, lifted themselves out of poverty, high achievement in every profession and occupation. We're in a third cycle now. And what's very encouraging now is that while we need additional legislation, particularly with regards to police reform and legislation with regards to funding of educational opportunity in communities of color, the critical variable that seems to be in play this time is the hearts that are changing. And that makes me really optimistic, Father Peter.
Yeah. You have a final thought? I'm looking at our clock, and it's going to tick tock right on into the liturgy, which is in 15 or 14 minutes. Do you have a final thought before we
I am deeply appreciative of St. Mark's and your courage. It just gives me so much hope, and knowing that the church is standing in front of us, and we're walking together with this. So I am deeply appreciative I've heard from so many different members of the parish that have reached out on their own to share their stories, their narratives. I'll just give a shout out to Jack Donahue, who shared his memory of meeting Martin Luther King and what that felt like and how the look in his eyes. So to hear those messages from some of our members of we're in it together, we're going with this, we're going together, is so inspiring and encouraging. So I thank you.
Yeah. Well, just say again.
I do have a similar comment from someone who wrote in that I think is
Please
beautiful
do, Jill.
to share, if that's okay. So this statement says, we're encouraged by seeing our 17-year-old daughter every day talking passionately about the injustices of racial inequalities. She chose to leave the New Canaan school system and attend a very progressive, diverse, all-girls boarding school. that has shaped her views. It's been invaluable in her formation and opening her mind. Social media is also playing an important role. It's happening.
Beautiful.
Thank you for that comment. Without saying too much, I know who that comes from, and I'll just say that my grandmother went to that school, that unnamed school in Troy, New York. Here, so beautiful. You've brought up so many times today, and we've talked about narrative, the importance for us all to hear each other's stories, to be big-hearted listeners, to have the power of empathy. And I just want to say again that if you haven't read Tom's book, From Willard Straight to Wall Street, Thomas W. Jones, a memoir, award-winning memoir, and if you really want to set your heart on a narrative, this is one to set your heart on. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. And also, if you haven't seen the interview that I did with Lise a little bit ago, I suggest you can find it on our website. There's something on the marquee that scrolls across, and it's called Talking About Race in America, and click on that, and the interview and the talks that we've had there. And I've also said the shocking thing is my own kids, preachers' kids, who really are unimpressed by all things church, on their own have tuned into you two. And we are so delighted that you continue to share yourselves with us. The more you share yourselves with us, the more we all grow. And so we've got one more week with you, so please come back. Don't decide to take a pandemic vacation and go somewhere, okay? So come back here next Sunday. Everybody, come on back. We're going to do this one more time before we go out to Holy Communion. So peace and blessings to each of you. Happy Father's Day, Tom, and to Jeff when you get home, too. So God bless you all. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.